coming. Before we start, let's join our voices and sing praises to the Lord. Please open your songbooks to page 625. I'm pressing on the upward way. Number 625. Let's join our voices. I'm pressing on the upward way. New height I'm gaining every day. Still praying as I onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and I shall stand. By faith on heaven's stable land, higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise and fears dismay. Though some may dwell where this above, I pray my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and I shall stand. By faith on heaven's stable land, higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Number 4. I want to scale the utmost height and catch a gleam of glory bright. But still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and I shall stand. By faith on heaven's stable land, higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Thank you, everyone, for singing.
Thank you. Good morning. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Loving Father in heaven, Lord, we just want to thank you so much for a new life that you give us this morning. Father, as we gather together to learn about how to sustain on these coming days, I pray, Lord, that your presence will be with us. Give our speaker the word to speak, Father, that we be able to hear and understand. And Bible, Father, open our hearts that we may be receptive. Give us a mind that will be able to understand. Be in our midst, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. It's been 4 years since we planned this, actually, in my mind. Actually, you folks are very fortunate. You know why? I drove to Fresno to listen to these folks. And once I heard them, I said, I have to bring them down to church. And not only to our church in Chula Vista, but into our country and our sister churches. I'm glad to see folks from north and from the south throughout the country. The only church that I didn't left flyers was Valley Center and Ramona. That was the only church. Other than that, all of our churches, including Spanish churches, received. So, as on my part, my hands is clean, okay? They cannot blame me for not letting them know of what's happening here. But I'm glad for each one of you that are here. Cricket's Nancy has been doing this for several years. Huh? Okay. Where's Nancy? Nancy is over there. Come here, Nancy. So all people can know who you are. this lady inspired me so much that I end up start canning at home. So this is Nancy and Craig. You will know Craig pretty soon. But anyhow, we drove all the way to Fresno to listen to them. And I saw that is really great. Our people need to know this, okay? He's not coming to, to try to scare any of us, but rather to bring us to reality that what has been given to us that we have not really dug out, okay? So we are all fortunate to have them in our midst this weekend. And Greg, we tried to get him here for, actually in 2017, we finally got able to get an appointment with them. But when the time came when they were supposed to be here, Greg got sick, ended up in the urgent care or emergency. So now they are here, and let's give them the time before Greg.
Thank you. Thank you, Efren. I didn't know you'd gone to Fresno to hear that. We meet thousands of people, so I forget. But thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I have a feeling there's somebody here in the audience, at least one, that ran into obstacles trying to get here today. Because the devil doesn't want you to be here. The devil doesn't want me to be here. He sure tried to take me out. I'm going to begin this morning talking about two things. Well, today we're going to talk about two things. The first part isn't going to last too long, but we're going to identify just part of the problems that we're facing, that not all of you are aware of what we're facing. You're certainly not being told on the news. I call it the snooze. The devil wants to put you to sleep. Like I said yesterday, in that vision the Lord gave Ellen White of the train going down the track, and everybody on the train's just sleeping away, bouncing along, and the conductor, who is the devil, is going up and down the center aisle, looking at everyone, making sure you're sound asleep as the train heads to perdition. Devil making sure you're watching the snooze, reading the newspaper, whatever, just to keep you asleep and not know that the Lord is coming soon. So, without further ado, I want to get started in identifying just a little of the problems that we're facing. Now, once again, I'm going to be zeroing in on electromagnetic pulse. There are many other things, but I don't have time to go in to all the other things that are in store for us in this country. I don't know all the other things, but there are certainly others. I know quite a few others, but I don't have time. We're going to talk a little bit about electromagnetic pulse this morning. Is there anyone here who, besides Efren, that have been to our seminars? Anyone here? Okay. You've probably seen what I'm about to show, a clip from an interview we had with former U.S. Congressman Roscoe Bartlett. He was a congressman for the 6th District of Maryland, and he served as a congressman for 20 years. He's now retired. He's probably in his 90s now. He wasn't in his 90s there. And a few years back, I was with a group. I don't know if any of you ever heard of rallies called Out of the Cities rallies. We went to major cities around the U.S. Several ministries did. We were blessed to be one of those little ministries. And we gave seminars, and talked about serious things. And I just want to reiterate what Efren said. We're not here to scare you, folks. We're here to face reality. if you believe the Bible, particularly Revelation, if you believe the spirit of prophecy, particularly the last 8 chapters in the great controversy, you'll know all is not well. And while I'm saying that, I want to highly recommend reading, if not the whole book. If you've never read Great Controversy, I highly recommend reading it. It's one of the best books besides the Bible that I have read. And particularly the last 8 chapters. And I can pretty well guarantee you, when you get finished, you and your wife or family, I recommend the whole family get together and the priest of the family read it. I can almost guarantee that when you get finished with it, you can turn around and read it again, and it'll almost be like you haven't read it. Because things are happening so fast. They're happening much faster now to me. I am an observer. I'm trying to watch what's going on. And to me, they're happening faster now than they were 5 years ago. I'm kind of the type of person that if I was in a foxhole, I'd have to stick my head up and look around and see what was going on. I'd probably catch a bullet in my head. But I have this insatiable desire to see what's going on, to watch. And we do this from our home out in the mountains. Former U.S. Congressman Roscoe Bartlett. I was with this team, and we were giving a rally in the Maryland area. And when Congressman Roscoe Bartlett and one of his sons showed up at our rallies, I didn't know who he was. I'd never met him. He's a Seventh-day Adventist, by the way. And started talking with him. Actually, I gave my seminar, went to the back of the room. There were hundreds there. And I sat in the back of the room. This man came over and sat down next to me and started talking with me. And turned out to be former U.S. Congressman Bartlett. And I got to know him a little bit. We talked a little bit. And well, let me just tell you a little bit more about him. I went online to find out a little bit more about him, and I found out that he served 10 terms in the House of Representatives. Each term is 2 years. That totals 20 years. He was on the House Armed Services Committee. That is one of the most powerful committees in our nation. He was one of 3 scientists in the Congress. I thought there might be more than that, but he was one of 3. And he was the authority in Congress on electromagnetic pulse, EMPs. Let me tell you a little bit more about him also, and it's not up on the screen. He has a PhD in human physiology. He headed up a 30-man research team at Johns Hopkins University. All of this was before he became a congressman. He taught at Howard University School of Medicine. He taught at Loma Linda University School of Medicine. He is an inventor. He has multiple inventions, and many are with NASA on respiratory devices. He's also a builder. I can relate to that. I'm a retired builder and developer, and he's a retired builder and developer. Now, like I said, he is a Seventh-day Adventist. Now, when I talked with him, he was telling me various things. As a matter of fact, he has a getaway in the West Virginia mountains, and he told me all about a house he had there. And he said, if you know anybody in your seminars, if you meet anyone, he said, I have this house sitting there, and if they're wanting to get out of the city and they can't afford it, they can stay there for free. Now, there'll be a caretaker for his property there, but he said they can live here for free. And so that was 5, 6 years ago. I'm sure that's not available now. But he told me I had heard, or somehow I had heard, I did know who he was before we went there, I'm sorry. And I had heard that he had a house in Frederick, Maryland, and that he carpooled with several other congressmen between Frederick and, some people call it the swamp, the Capitol building. And he's a very conservative, financially very conservative congressman. And he invited Nancy and I, and our son was with us at that time before he got married, and he invited us to his place for the weekend. Well, I had never met a congressman in my life, and when he invites you to your place, you say, "Yes, sir." And so I said, "Yes, sir." I didn't say that, but I was thrilled to be asked. And then when he told us how to get to his place, it wasn't to his house in Frederick, Maryland. It was to a place deep in the West Virginia mountains. Have any of you ever heard of Greenbrier? Okay, Greenbrier is no longer in use by the federal government. It used to be used, it was top secret, and I mean very top secret place deep in the West Virginia mountains. And it was a place where our government officials would go to, I can't think of the word, in case we come under a nuclear attack, for continuation of our government. Only they had bunkers underground, this big resort, under this big resort called Greenbrier. It was very top secret. Now I understand they have another one and even better somewhere else, and I have no idea where it is. Greenbrier has been retired. Well, Congressman Bartlett told us how to get to his place. And we didn't know it was out near Greenbrier. We went driving along on this country road deep in the mountains. We went by this place, and there was a sign, Greenbrier Resort or whatever, and we knew what it was. We'd heard about it. So we went on, and Congressman Bartlett told us where to go, that we'd come to a single-lane gravel driveway. He said, "You won't see a house, but just follow that road." And then he said, "You'll come to an older house." He didn't say older, but he said, "You'll come to a house, pull into the garage. The garage door will be open." So sure enough, we went down that gravel drive. We came to this house, pulled into the garage, and the back wall went up. It was actually a big garage door. So we drove into the garage through an open garage door, and the back wall in the form of a garage door opened, and the driveway just continued right on through. So we followed that. We thought, this is going to be very interesting. We went back, and we found Congressman Bartlett's home. And he and his wife were so gracious, greeted us. His wife's name is Ellen. I understand she was named after Ellen White. We got out, they showed us around, and lo and behold, there's no power back there. He doesn't even have a generator. He has so many solar panels. This man can afford it. He has so many solar panels, he does not need a generator. And he showed us around the house. Mrs. Bartlett cooks on a wood cook stove. And they heat their home with this wood cook stove, and then they have another wood stove placed in another part of the house, pretty good sized house. And he told us about his water system. His water system is a spring up the mountain. He has over 100 acres there. And he's captured that spring, and we have a DVD that shows you how to capture water out of a spring in a very sanitary way. And then he pipes it down to his house, and that long run and the difference in elevation gives a tremendous water pressure. It's called gravity flow water. And so I took a shower, and he gets their hot water from an Amish, I can't even think of I'm sorry, I can't think of these things this morning. A range boiler. Anyone here ever hear of a range boiler? It's like a boiler coated on the inside with a cultured stone or something like that. And in his wood stove, in the wood box, the firebox, he has a coil, a stainless steel coil. And he has it plumbed in to the range boiler, which is up higher than the stove. And so the water in that coil in the firebox of the wood-burning cook stove heats up, and you know the principle of hot water, hot air rising. Well, when the water gets heated, the water rises, goes out through the plumbing, into the range boiler, and then it circulates right back down to get reheated again. It's a tremendous way to have your hot water. And I know our son had that system until they moved to another place. And I think he wants to have that system again. Anyway, so when I took a shower, I thought, here I am about to take a shower with pure spring water right out of the mountain, gravitational flow, and that water has been heated by wood in a range boiler and a wood cook stove. And I thought, this is the cat's pajamas. So I thought I'd take that baby for a ride, and I took a long shower, and it didn't begin to run out of hot water. So we really enjoyed our stay there with Congressman Bartlett. After a while, everywhere we would go, Nick is our producer, he's our videographer, etc. And so we always took our camera, tripod, equipment, and everything with us on these trips. And I asked Congressman Bartlett if he would mind if we interviewed him. And he said, sure. He said something like CNN had interviewed him over 40 times. And so he said, yeah, that'll be fine. So he pulled up a chair, I pulled up a chair, Nick set up the camera, and I started asking questions. And that man took off for an hour and a half. It's like he had a lot of things to tell you folks. Because he knew we were going all over the country to Seventh-day Adventist churches and talking. And so I think he had an idea that we would be showing that interview. Well, we are showing a very small snippet of it, like a 6-minute clip that Nick edited out. And so I want to show you that clip and want to make sure the volume is correct on this.
People in cities are very, very tightly packed together. Where you have that many people, just the odds that there will be a bad apple or two in a barrel, that the number of those go up because of all the people that are there. And I just think that rational people in looking at the situation in the world today would realize that that they would be better off, they and their families would be better off if they were more self-sufficient, if they were outside the city. And by the way, there are other things that could bring on this crisis other than oil. There is a phenomenon very well known to people who plan wars and build weapons that the average citizen may not know about, and that is called EMP. And this is electromagnetic pulse. It's produced various ways, but the most widespread pulse would be produced by a nuclear weapon detonated above the atmosphere. Our country has only one experience with that. This was in 1962, I believe it was, over Johnston Island, and we had an extra atmospheric burst. The weapon was detonated above the atmosphere, and this produced a surprising consequence. There was a huge flow of what today are called Compton electrons, and it was like a huge solar flare, orders of magnitude stronger than a solar flare, like really strong static electricity everywhere all at once. Another way of thinking about it is like a lightning strike everywhere. The Russian generals tell us that the Soviets, and I can quote this because this is in the public domain, it's not classified, tell us that the Soviets had developed an EMP weapon that produced 200 kilovolts per meter at the center. A weapon detonated 300 miles high above the United States would reach a line of sight the margins of our country, Florida and northwest Washington. And this would produce at the margins about 100 kilovolts per meter. If that's true, that is considerably more, I think, than anything that we designed and tested to during the Cold War when everybody was concerned about EMP. By the way, almost any country that has nuclear weapons in any war game, an EMP laydown is an early occurrence in that war game. And when the referee is there monitoring the war game, they just take their hand and wipe most of the assets off the table. Because what the EMP does is to, if it's strong enough, and 100 kilovolts per meter would be strong enough, it fries all microelectronics. That means there will be no more computers. Your car is full of them. There will be no more electricity. The only person you can talk to is the person next to you, unless you happen to be a ham operator with a vacuum tube set, which is 1,000,000 times less susceptible. The only way you can go anywhere is to walk, unless you happen to have a car that has a coil and condenser. And then you, of course, need to get some gasoline for your car. This would be a horrendous kind of an experience. I sponsored legislation about 6 years ago that set up an EMP commission. I'm sure if you do a Google search, you can find this. It's the EMP commission. Unlike most commissions that work for a year or two and are then retired, the EMP commission is still working because this is very serious. Our Pentagon is looking at all of their weapons systems. By the way, our military is very concerned about the power grid. And they are looking at what's called islanding because they get much of their power from the private sector. Now, they, like a hospital, they have some generators and some diesel, but that's only going to run for a little while. Then what do you do when that runs out? Because the grid could go down and stay down for a very long time. It is kind of on the edge, on the margin. And you may have noticed that when there is a tiny problem in one place, that can really cascade and bring the power down, as it did in Florida not very long ago, over a very wide area when several million people are out of electricity for a number of hours. So there are a number of events that could create a situation in the cities where civil unrest would be a very high probability. And I think that those who can and those who understand need to take advantage of the opportunity when these winds of strife are not blowing to move their families out. I'll tell you something else about this. It's just plain fun. When you're looking at the challenge of what do I have to do so that I'm independent of the system? And you need to know that in our large cities, there's about 3 days' supply of food. Now, those supermarket shelves may look really full, and they are, because when you're taking it off, the clerks are stocking the shelves. And if they didn't stock the shelves just at the rate that you take it off without a panic, all those shelves will be empty in about 3 days because the trucks need to keep running to keep those shelves full. What if the trucks didn't run? There are a number of things that could bring about situations where there could be really serious civil unrest in the cities. So I think that provident people who understand, who have a responsibility to their families, will be looking more and more to getting out of the cities. And it's a huge challenge. There's no exhilaration like the exhilaration of meeting and overcoming a big challenge. You stop and think about, gee, what do I need to do so that I can be independent out there? That if the world fell apart, it really wouldn't matter for me and my family. That's really an interesting challenge. By the way, one other reason for doing this is it's a really patriotic thing to do. Because for all of our citizens who aren't dependent on the state when an emergency happens, we're going to be stronger and stronger, aren't we? So as a member of Congress, I'm concerned. I would like everybody to do this. I would like everybody to have a year's supply of food. I'd like everybody to have some plan so that they can make do if any one of these emergencies occurs. But it's going to be easier to do that. And you'll avoid the problems of civil unrest if you're out of the cities and out in the country.
Have you ever heard a politician talk like that? I always ask that question. I never have. And they know better. I'll tell you one that knows better. He used to be Speaker of the House. His name is Newt Gingrich. You've heard of him? He's on Fox News a lot. He knows better. And he even endorsed a very interesting book about EMPs because he knows better. Now, yes, sir?
EMP and electromagnetic field the same?
EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. It's the same thing.
Same thing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Now, I want you to know this interview was not planned, was not rehearsed. This man just sat down in front of this rock wall, which he probably laid himself, and he just started talking. Now, after the interview, Congressman Bartlett told us about 12 very important electrical substations throughout the U.S., 12. Now, there are thousands, literally, I think between 2,000 or 3,000, I'm not sure, substations around the United States. He said there are 12 substations located, strategically located around the country. And he said if those 12 substations are taken out, our whole power grid goes down. They are that important. I understand it's down to 9 very important substations. Now, in these substations are these huge transformers, and they're very costly. I understand they cost millions and millions of dollars. We used to make those in this country, but we don't make what we used to make in this country anymore. Now, it seems like the current president is trying to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., but right now, the way it stands, there's only, I think, 2 or 3 countries that make these huge transformers. And they're so large that there's only 4 railroad cars, I hear, that can handle the weight of these huge transformers. And they don't stockpile these transformers. Probably, I don't understand why, but it might be because of the weight, the cost, and how long it takes to manufacture just one of these. It takes 18 to 24 months to manufacture one of these huge transformers. So, this is extremely significant because there are 11 different governmental studies that have documented that if the power grid goes down for a year or more. Now, I'm not trying to be sensational, folks. I couldn't believe this hardly when I first read this, but when you look for it on the internet, you'll find it. There are 9 governmental studies that say that if our power grid goes down for a year or more, up to 90% of our population could die. Why could that happen? Friends, we are the most advanced nation in the world. We rely on electricity more than any other nation. People in Mexico are trying to get into this country. When our power grid goes down, there'll be people up here trying to get into Mexico because they're not as advanced as we are. Therefore, they're set up better than we are because we rely on electricity so much. Let me play you a short clip of Kevin Freeman. Anyone ever hear of him? He is a global financial analyst. I know when I showed this clip at a preparedness fair in Spokane, there was a couple that came up, and they said this man knows what he's talking about. So let me show you this 30-second clip of what he says.
11 different governmental studies, mostly congressional, but some foreign studies, have documented that a loss of the power grid for an extended period, not 5 or 6 days, but maybe a year or longer, could result in the loss of as much as 90% of American lives.
Now, friends, I want to reiterate that there are many things that we're not being told, more than electromagnetic pulse, more than our power grid going down. There are many other things. We don't have time to get into that. I'm just focusing on that right now. There are 3 ways the power grid could come down. Now, why am I concerned about the power grid? I just alluded to the fact that we are so reliant on electricity. You heard Congressman Bartlett, who is the authority on EMPs. He was when he was in the Congress, and I imagine he still is. We have electromagnetics, microelectronics in almost everything. Without those, we'd be dead in the water, literally, in this nation. So if our power grid goes down, we are in deep, deep trouble. One way our power grid can go down is through an EMP. There are 2 other ways. The second way is through a cyber attack, or Cyber 9/11. The former head of our Department of Homeland Security, the former head of that, Janet Napolitano, I think most of you have heard of her, said that it's not a matter of if, but when the power grid goes down. Now, the third way that we can have or that the nation's power grid can go down, or let's say those 9 strategically located substations could go down, which would take our whole power grid down. The third way that can happen is the one that sends cold chills up my back and down my back, and that is through a terror attack. Now, do you think we might have terrorists in this country? You better believe it. They're coming across the southern border, I understand, all the time. Did we have a terror attack, 9/11? Just think how much worse it is now. I'm most concerned about this. Let me show you a little clip from the Wall Street Journal, which came out a few years ago. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Yes. Number 1 was the EMP. Number 2, cyber attack. And number 3 is a terrorist attack. And I'm about to show you something that when this is finished, I'm going to ask you who knew about this. This was in the Wall Street Journal.
A middle-of-the-night assault on a California power station has one former regulator claiming it's a terrorist attack. Welcome to your Wednesday lunch break. I'm Sarah Murray. The April 16th attack is basically unknown to most Americans, but it's raising new concerns about the vulnerability of the U.S. power grid. Joining me with the latest is the WSJ reporter who uncovered this story, Rebecca Smith. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
So give me an idea of what happened at this power station.
What happened was really unprecedented. In the dead of night, a small team of gunmen attacked a U.S. power substation near San Jose. So it's a substation that feeds power to Silicon Valley. We had 19 minutes in which to shoot up key pieces of equipment. They completely knocked out the substation. And the fear now is that if they were part of a larger group, it would be possible to hit multiple substations and theoretically bring down the U.S. grid.
That is really incredible. Do they have any idea who is responsible for this?
Well, the FBI isn't talking for obvious reasons. They still haven't made any arrests. So we don't really know if they have a theory. People who were privy to the investigation in earlier periods say that they really didn't seem to have any good leads. So we hope that's not the case. We hope they'll catch the people.
Now, one of the people who's raising alarms about this is John Wellinghoff. He was the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at the time. Why is he speaking out now? You know,
I think that Mr. Wellinghoff, after the attack, he was extremely alarmed. And he went to a variety of federal agencies, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, the FBI, Congress, the White House, everywhere he could go, warning that this was a very serious attack, that this was an unprecedented attack, and that it required swift action. And he felt like he didn't get traction with it anywhere. One of the problems is there really isn't any agency that is responsible for the security of the U.S. grid. So as he put it, no one feels it's their job to do this.
It seems really incredible that an attack like this could happen on a really important power station and we would never hear about it. I mean, why didn't we know this was happening?
If you go back and look at the reports that came out at the time, there were a couple TV stations went down because following the attack, there was a call for energy conservation in Silicon Valley. So there was a little bit of public awareness that something had happened to this substation. But the utility, federal officials, and investigators all tried to keep the specifics out of the public attention. They didn't want to attract copycat attacks, and I think they really didn't want to telegraph to our nation's enemies that we have this vulnerability.
So what's the big worry now? I mean, that these people could just keep hitting other power stations?
I think there's a great worry now as so much time has elapsed and no one has been arrested. We don't know whether this is a small group of nuts. We don't know whether this is part of an organized group that is planning a larger Al-Qaeda style attack. We just really don't know who it is. And in the absence of that knowledge, it feeds fears.
All right, a lot of uncertainty there. Rebecca Smith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How many of you heard anything about this? Okay, there's usually 2 or 3 at every church that has heard about this. Folks, you live right down the road from Silicon Valley. You should have heard about it. They don't want you to know about it. But yet they put enough out there to where if anybody ever accuses them of covering it up, they say, well, look, it was on the Wall Street Journal or this or that. I believe this could be a trial run for what's to come on a larger scale. I did a little research into this, and lately I've found out that President Trump is the first president and really the first president that's wanting to do something about it. Nothing or very little has been done about this in the past. I also learned that there was a man driving by on some 4-lane highway near this substation. He noticed some sparks through a grove of trees or whatever, and he called 911 and said, I saw sparks at this substation. So the county Mounties were, there was, I think a couple of units went out to check this substation, and you know substations are usually, they're just really not guarded very much. They have a chain link fence around them, locked gates, and they have street lights. And so the county deputies rode out. They noticed the gate was still locked. They looked around, they didn't see anything, and so they radioed back to headquarters, said, things look okay, and they left. But what had happened was Homeland Security called in the Navy SEALs to inspect this substation. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. County, excuse me, the county deputies called in, nothing had happened, but pretty soon, back at the local district office where the meters are for that district at PP&G, they noticed that power station started going down. They went into emergency action and rerouted the load to other surrounding stations. Remember, this was in the middle of the night, and so there wasn't that much pull on the transformers, or not as much as during the day. And they were able to reroute through other substations and keep the majority of the area from going down. Otherwise, more of you would have raised your hands. You would have heard more about it. They saved the area from having a big power outage. Now, Department of Homeland Security, or John Wellinghoff, the head of the Federal Energy Commission, in addition to calling the FBI, DHS, Department of Defense, Congress, even the White House, I think this happened during the Obama administration, they called the Navy SEALs to come out. Now, why would they call Navy SEALs to come out and check this substation that went down? Well, the SEALs walked around the substation, and the reason they were called out is because it's their expertise to go to third world countries and take down their power grid. And so this is what I understand. They walked around and they said, yep, this is exactly the way we would have done it. And they started pointing out little piles of gravel all around the substation. And then they picked up spent AK-47 shells near these rock piles. And they said snipers, these little piles indicated where they need to locate, and it would help identify which transformer they needed to shoot holes in. You see, these transformers hold oil. They're big metal, rectangular, square-shaped tanks. And the oil in it is used to keep the transformer cool. So these snipers, these terrorists, shot holes well below the oil line so the oil would leak out slowly. And I emphasize slowly because it would give them time to get away, and that's what happened. They also found a manhole nearby. They went down, and there were a couple there, 2 or 3, and in one of the manholes they found fiber optics cables, very strategic fiber optics cables that had been clipped. In other words, whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Yes, ma'am. It was in the San Jose area. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Now, I think I told you everything that you needed. I need to go on because I don't need to spend any more time on this. But I think you get the picture that our enemies know, they have to know about these 9 strategically located substations. And there is enough information out there to say, you folks could go home and research on the internet. Some of you on smartphones now are probably researching it. And you could find out that it takes 18 to 24 months to replace these substations, these huge transformers that are most necessary to send that high voltage long distances and then step it down once it gets to its place. Now, you've got to realize, folks, what could happen if we lose our power for a year or more? Think about that. I challenge every one of you to go home, go to your breaker box, and turn that main breaker off for 24 or 36 hours. And get a paper and pen out and take notes of what it's like to live without power. Now, you can always go over to the faucet if you're on a city water system, municipal water system, or even a community water system. You can always turn that water faucet on, and water almost always comes out, doesn't it? But when the national power is down, that water is going to run out in a matter of days, if not immediately. You might still have some water towers up in the air that has water in it that'll give you water pressure. There might be a huge tank up a nearby hill or mountain. But I have lived through 2 weeks of no water where I came from in the south, where there was a terrible flood, and the waterworks was built decades and decades ago. It wasn't a smart move. They built the waterworks on the edge of this river, and everything got swept away. And a good part of middle Georgia was without water for 2 weeks. We were on that system, and we were without water for 2 weeks. So I know it can happen. When the power goes down, your water's going to go down. Your food, you folks live just south of the food basket for the nation, the San Joaquin Valley. I've never seen so many groceries growing in one area of the country like I have coming down I-5. It's amazing. But for someone that wasn't raised here, I remember the first time I drove down I-5. I was just blown away by all the groceries, whether plants, orchards, whatever. And I realized why this is called the nation's breadbasket. But then I started noticing the hills right behind the fields, just dry as a bone. In other words, if the farmers didn't irrigate their field, the field would just dry up just like those mountains or hills behind them. And then I started seeing signs. This is 4, 5, 6 years ago. These big billboards that said, "Food grows where water flows." Now, how does water flow? What makes water flow? Electricity. And I started noticing that magnificent aqueduct system where they use gravity flow, where it would slowly flow down these big, what do you call them? I'm sorry? Yes, aqueducts. And then they'd run out of elevation, and then they'd have these huge electrical water pumps that would lift them up to do the same thing again till it came to the next pumping lift station. What's going to happen, friends, when the power is gone? It might not go out within a few hours. It might not even go out. The water might not stop within a few days or even a few weeks. It might take longer. But you're going to run out of water. And then you're going to run out of food. And I'll explain another. I know I need to end this and get going on another topic. But I've got to share this with you. One time at our home, I'd left to go somewhere. Nancy wanted me to pick up some groceries from the grocery store. And it was windy. I mean, I couldn't remember when it had been so windy in that part of Idaho. And I noticed power lines were down here and there. And so I did what I had to do. Then I stopped off at the grocery store on the way home and got out and went up to the grocery store, and I couldn't get in. The lights were off, of course. The power was down. But there was a little sign on the window that said closed due to power outage. And I did a lot of thinking after that. It's not going to take the San Joaquin Valley running out of water that's going to stop our flow of food. I mean, that will be stopped over a period of time. But when the power goes down, folks, I experienced this firsthand. They lock their front doors, the grocery stores do. Why? Let me give you a few reasons why. They have tens of thousands of dollars worth, if not $100,000 or a couple of $100,000 worth of frozen foods in there. Depends on the size of the store. And meat that needs to be kept cool, and dairy products that need to be kept cool. And they can't afford people wandering up and down the aisles grabbing food and going to these refrigeration units and opening and closing them. And they're losing that precious cool that's keeping that food fresh. Another reason they lock the doors. Did you know the majority of people, by far, the majority of the people in this country that buy anything uses a debit card or a credit card? You have to have electricity for that to work. These grocery stores will know when the power goes down, they're not going to get paid by most people. Very few people use cash anymore. Even if you do use cash, are the cash registers going to work so you can get change? Friends, you need to think this through. The food's going to stop. The water's going to stop. The heat is going to stop. You don't have to worry about heat down here as much as we do up there. Those of you who are on meds, they're going to stop. Those of you who have loved ones in assisted livings like I did. I used to worry. What are we going to do when the power goes out? And my mother was in an assisted living in the hot South. No windows that would open. How would they survive something like that? No medications, no water, probably dying from heat stroke, et cetera, et cetera. And there are literally thousands of facilities like that around the nation. High-rise apartments that depend on electricity for everything. Friends, think this through. Now, I want to show you something else. This is a major problem, and I showed this picture yesterday. The lights are where the people are. Did you know that 80% of our population lives in cities? 80%. I'm told it's more than 80%. Now, when you have 80% of our nation's population living in cities, that's approximately 270 some odd million people in this country, if not more by now. When you have that, that's very high density. When you have a high population, that usually means more laws, more regulations, which in turn means less freedom and less liberty, which could and probably will lead to less liberty of conscience. Friends, isn't this what it boils down to? You must be free to worship God. To worship God on the proper, the correct day. Now, along with high population density comes apartments and flats. And then a little farther out, you have this. Now, is this much better? Sure, these are not apartments stacked or closely together or whatever, but let me kind of give you a little scenario of what could happen. Let's say Bill lives here and Joe lives there, and they go to a preparedness expo or whatever, or they read a book, or they come to one of these seminars, that we give or somebody else gives or whatever, and they start to wake up and they start thinking, what are we going to do when we don't have water? We can't get groceries from the grocery store, and let's say they live in a cooler climate and they can't get heat. Now let me tell you, I've got to say this from a builder's point of view. Those of you who are on propane or natural gas, you might think, well, I'll have heat. No, you won't. Because the engineers that engineered your propane and natural gas systems engineered blowers in those that have to be running when that system fires up to keep it cool and to keep it from burning your house down. So when the power goes down, doesn't matter if you have natural gas or propane heat, you're not going to have heat. So they start talking between themselves. Now there's a fence separating this row of houses from this row of houses. And they start realizing, Joe and Bill, that what are we going to do if this really does happen? And they think, we need to learn how to garden. We need to do something. We can't survive in this subdivision. And so they realized that and neither one of them knew how to garden. So they thought, we need to at least start planting and get a little understanding of gardening so we can grow our own food in a situation like that. So they tear this fence down. They don't care what the authorities are going to say about tearing the fence down. They get a rototiller and they till up all the land, which isn't very much, between their houses. Folks, do any of you live in an area where you don't have much land to grow? So they till up their soil. They plant the garden. After a while, and I want to tell you this, when you decide to obey God and start preparing, getting out of the city, whatever, your children are going to love it. We've heard this time and time again. We have experienced this. And so their children really get on board. They are so excited. They're going to learn how to garden. And Joe and Bill and their wives, they get on the internet and buy books and whatever, and they're learning how to garden. Let me tell you, you can read books, but there's nothing like getting out there and getting your hands and feet in the soil. It's a learning process, and it still is for us after 20 years, close to 20 years. So pretty soon, their garden back here starts producing little green squash and little green tomatoes and other things start sprouting. And the kids, everybody's excited. Man, this is really working. And then after a while, that green squash starts turning yellow. And those green tomatoes start turning red. And the watermelons are getting bigger. And the bell pepper is getting bigger. The corn starting to bring ears of corn. And they are so excited. And then the power goes down. They wake up one morning after a few days, maybe even a week or two, and they look out, they're waiting for those vegetables, what few vegetables there are, to see how they're coming along, and nothing's left. You know what I'm talking about. They have been stripped. Now, I don't want to go any farther than this, but friends, those of you who live in very tight quarters know what I'm talking about. This is why we're here this weekend, to bring to your attention, to identify the problems that are there, and there are many more that could be there. I just went down one avenue called electromagnetic pulse equals no power grid. This is why we're here this weekend. We want you to be in a position. We want you to go home and examine where you live now and ask yourself, am I living where I can have a well driller drill a well in my backyard for backup water? Or is there a stream that flows across my property where I can get water? I can buy a filter the water. This is how we have lived for the last 18, 19 years. Now, I'm jumping around on you here, but I want you to know we don't live like a bunch of bums or whatever you call us out in the mountains. We moved from a very nice 4,400 square foot home. The basement was unfinished. I was building mansions for people. The last home I built was 10,000 square feet under the roof for a customer. And the Lord showed us in no uncertain terms that it was time for us to get out of our subdivision where over 2,000 homes were in that gated community. And so we did. So it's not that we went out and we're living very primitive. We are not. We're living in the South, we say, like we're walking in tall cotton. We live very well. We have our own electrical system. In fact, when I left that grocery store I told you about, and it was locked up, it was closed down, I went home, walked in the back door and told Nancy the grocery store was closed, so I didn't get the groceries. And I said, did you know power is out 60 miles around? They said, no. We didn't know, because Meissner Power and Light was up and running. And it has been for the last 19, going on 20 years. And friends, wild horses couldn't drag us back. Telling you. It's a wonderful feeling to be living, like Congressman Bartlett said a while ago, when you're in a position, when you know it comes down and it's going to happen someday. We know it's not going to get any better when you read the prophecies. You know that you'll at least be in a position to have your own independent water system, independent heat, and independent food. So we're going to start right now, and we'll break for lunch and then continue after lunch, giving you the solutions. This is most important. I'm finished with the gory details or whatever, but friends, I just want you to realize all is not well. So, without further ado, Nancy's going to start talking about independent food supplies.
Good morning. I feel like I need to add something to what Craig said, because you may have the idea that we had a lot of money when we moved out, just because we were building big homes, and because we had a home ourselves. You know what comes with the home when you're in the rat race? That's debt. And we had made the determination that we were not in a position at this time in history that we did not want to be in debt. So when we moved out, we didn't move out in high style. We moved out very simply. It's not primitive, and that's what Craig was trying to tell you. It's not primitive. We live comfortably, but very simply. Our home now is a cabin, unfinished still after 19 years, but very comfortable, very cozy, 1,300 square feet. So I didn't want you to get the idea that because you might not have been building big homes yourself and selling them, that you couldn't do this. In fact, if you were here yesterday afternoon, I shared a little bit about what God can do when you have done your part, even though it might just be a little tiny part. And I shared with someone this morning, and maybe this is a time to share it. Our son, when it came time for him to leave home and he felt that it was time for him to find his own place, he had invested everything he had in our ministry, in our work. And as he put it, he said, I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. But he said, I'm going to do what we tell the people that we talk to. You do what you can. And what he could do was go out and start looking at properties as though he had money. And he started checking them out. And he ended up finding a piece of property. A woman owned a piece of property that had a 5-acre tract on as part of her property that had a little cabin on it that was off-grid. And he knew that she wasn't wanting to sell it, so he talked to her about a long-term lease. And she said yes. There was nobody living in it at the time, and she said, yes, I would. And she said, all I really want is someone to keep it up and pay the property taxes. And she said, if you'll do that, you can lease it for up to 50 years. They signed an agreement. And do you know how much his yearly cost was for that cabin on 5 acres? $600 for the property taxes. $600 a year. We shared that with people in New York City that were paying $2,200 a month for a little flat and thinking, how am I going to get out? And we said, God knows. He knows your situation. He's done it for us, and he will do it for you. So now, I want to go on now with the gardening, but right now, in your current situation, are you depending upon somebody else? For instance, the big food corporations, to grow, harvest, and preserve food so that you can eat year-round? Have you ever thought of it that way? You're depending on someone else. How long could your family survive if you could not buy food at the grocery? Do you have a garden already? Or even pots, if you're not in a position to have a garden yet. Are you learning? Are you starting out in little boxes or pots? Well, do you have seeds that you could plant if you needed to get a garden started? What if you couldn't buy seeds? You know there's going to be a time that we can't buy or sell if we're faithful. And even if some of these other disasters haven't happened, we know for sure that that is coming. We do know that many disasters are coming too. But if you did have seeds, let's say you had seeds, how long would it take you to actually get food from that garden once you planted them? So doesn't happen overnight. What would you do in the meantime? There's a picture that I found. I believe this was from Venezuela. If you have not been keeping up with what's going on in Venezuela, probably about 4 years ago I started hearing about it. It had already been going on for several years then. And you weren't hearing it on mainstream news at all. Now it's all over the mainstream news. But if you just Google food shortages in Venezuela, you'll get a hint of what can happen even in a wealthy country. Because Venezuela is an oil-rich country, was. And the people there have been starving. The common people have been starving. Dogs and cats have been in short supply. I've heard that for several years. Even zoo animals were disappearing. People did not have food. They'd go and stand in a line, get up at sometime in the early morning hours, stand in a line, and by the time they could get to the line, get to the front, maybe whatever it was gone, or if they got it, they might have gotten robbed on their way home. It's incredible. You just need to Google it, because it's just reality of what can happen even in rich countries. So these are things that we are wanting to learn so that we're not in those positions. How many here have a garden every year? Is there anybody here that does? Yes, good, good. Well, let me ask you a question. Could you eat year-round from what you grow? I had a garden for many years in the South, and honestly, I have to say, it got to the point that I said, I'm putting more money into this garden than I'm getting anything out of. It's just, sometimes it's that way, and it doesn't have to be. But I want to ask you, though, if you have a garden and you have the food that's coming from it, could you make balanced, tasty meals all year long from what you've grown in that garden? Or would you mainly eat like sliced tomatoes in the warm weather and canned tomatoes in the cold? How about things like milk, oil, bread, cereal, things we eat every day, soups, salad dressings, chips, pizza, pasta, burgers? Do you know how to make things like that from your own produce? So right now, if you look at your own situation and realize that you're not in a position to be independent from the system for this basic necessity of life, then there's no time to lose. And I want to say once again, we are not here saying that you should not go to the grocery store. We're not at all saying don't enjoy the conveniences. There's a difference, though. Don't depend upon them. You need to have a plan, and you need to have already set aside a way that you can feed your family if those grocery stores were empty. You need to be in that position at all times. Go to the grocery store, enjoy the conveniences, get stuff from all over the world. I certainly do, but you can't be dependent on it. You catch the difference? There's a difference. So there's no time to lose. Today I just have a short time, and these are huge topics, so I'm going to hit some highlights that I have learned that I hope will be a help to you to get your wheels turning. So right now I want to cover some practices, tips, and tools that we've learned through years of trial and error. We live close to Canada. That's our heirloom tomatoes, that's our potatoes, that's our garden. The pictures I'm showing you are from our garden. It wasn't always this way. Many years I tried to garden, and it was just kind of a touch and go thing, and I was wanting, and we were in the South where I should have been able to have a good garden, but I hadn't really learned. And when we got into our new position and to our new property in Idaho, the first garden I did, I call it a pygmy garden. It was tiny little plants that didn't produce hardly anything, and I said, it's got to be that the soil is not in good shape. And so our son was still at home then, and he was such an inspiration. And he said, we can't do this in a time when we might have to depend upon what we're growing. We've got to have a successful garden every single year. So we went to experts. And I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute. But I want to say one of the things you want to do as you're getting going with this whole thing is start planning. Implement a plan. So you'll be prepared when you can't get food from the grocery. Without planning, you'll almost surely end up not having all of the items you need when you need them to make real meals. So my suggestion is to start by making up a sample weekly menu for your family and break down each of those meals into ingredients that you would need to make that meal from scratch. And then make 2 lists from that. Items you could grow yourself, and those items that you would have to purchase. You want that list to be very small because it's not sustainable, and you could run out of those things. Then step number 2, you prepare the foundation for a successful garden. Build up your soil nutrition, and that's about where I was with the fact that we went to experts, because we knew our soil had to be very depleted because we weren't getting good results. So we went to experts to learn how to garden successfully. And oh my, what a difference that has made. When we went, our son would ask if they would mind if we would film them so that other people could get their expertise, and we were able to do that. So, early on, we realized that this would be of great value to learn from others' times. One of the gentlemen we went to was Bob Jorgensen. He had researched, when we met him, when we filmed him, he had researched for over 30 years how to put the most nutrition into what you grow. That was his angle, nutrition, nutrition. You don't have to eat as much if it's highly nutritious, and that was very important to him and to us too. And we were able to film him. And we were so thrilled because it wasn't too many years after we filmed him that he passed away about 3 years ago at a very young age. And we said, of course we miss him, but we said, wouldn't it have been a terrible shame for all of those years of research to have been a waste, because he wanted so much to share. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he went all over the world talking, but he wanted to share. And in our gardening DVDs that we did of him, he not only shared all the things about gardening, but whatever came into his mind that would be helpful to someone else. He'd say, this is a good kind of boots to get for gardening, and tell you about that. And this is how to do your compost. You can use a garbage disposal, an old garbage disposal, and you can run all the stuff in your garden that you're not eating through that and make a mulch out of it. And so he gave all kinds of additional things. It wasn't just how to plant the seeds and how to water them and all. It's bunches of information. And the other gentleman that we filmed was Bob Gregory, one of the others. He has Berea Gardens Agricultural Center in West Virginia. He is a scientist. He had classes Monday through Friday, a course that we took. Cost about, Nick, I was going to tell about that on a little DVD clip, but it cost, I think, $500 a person when we went there, and that was a lot of money for us. But we said, we're serious about this. This is an investment. We have to be successful. We can't have a garden 1 year that is gone, either from the deer or from the pests or from the weather. We've got to be successful. And he teaches the science of gardening. And so when we finished the course, Nick sat down with him in his office and said, would you be willing to share this on DVD if we came back and filmed you doing the course? He, likewise, as Bob Jorgensen did, said yes. These men are not just money-oriented. They want to share what they know, and it's been so helpful to us. So learn from the experts, learn from books and DVDs, learn from other experienced gardeners in your own area, but as Craig said earlier, don't delay in getting first-hand experience. Get your hands in the soil. Depending on where you live, the location of your garden will have a lot to do with what you grow. Down here, that's not such a big factor. In a more northern location, and I'm going to give you this because you may know someone in a northern location, or sometime you might end up in a more northern location. But Elliot Coleman, he's an organic, well-known organic farmer in Maine, and he has written 4-Season Harvest book, the different books about gardening year-round in cold climates. And he wrote this along the 44th parallel, which is where he is in Maine, a garden on soil sloping just 5 degrees to the south will have the same solar climate as flatland 300 miles further south. Very interesting, especially in the northern climates. You want to make sure that you have an independent water supply. If you're dependent upon the power grid for your water supply to your garden, then you're in bad shape if that electric grid goes down. You could set up an independent system by putting a hand pump on your well. That's commonly what people think of, or having a well bucket. But honestly, for your garden, watering that way would be pretty labor intensive. This is our independent water system. That's a big, I think it's a 1,500 gallon tank, and Craig wanted it in black because we have a mountain creek running through our property. That water is cold year round. He wanted it black so the water would get warmer. And then there's a solar panel, and in that little metal box is the pump. And that is entirely for our garden and orchard so that we will have water no matter what, because we're not on the power grid to begin with. You would need to drain the system at the end of the growing season if you're in an area that has a hard freeze. As you begin to build up your soil and work it early in the season, here's a couple of very helpful tools. That's an English garden fork in the vertical picture. The British have been gardening for centuries, and they make very good tools that will last a long time. That's used to break up the soil before planting and also to harvest root crops. And that's a broad fork, the one there with my foot in it. And that is what I now use instead of a rototiller. The first number of years went every year through the garden with the rototiller and was trying to really break up the soil. And it was necessary for a period of time because we gardened in an area that had never been gardened before. But after a while, we had a lot of nice topsoil there, and I noticed that in the summertime, my soil would get very, very powdery and dry, and I had to water a lot. And I got some information and realized that once that soil is broken up and you have a good layer of topsoil, then you want to leave those layers of soil in place as much as possible so that you're not, I kind of call going down with the rototiller sort of like putting the soil in a blender and whizzing it up, because now you've got all this powdery soil and it doesn't really retain the moisture like it does if you can leave those layers in place. So now in the springtime, I go down the row that's about 3.5 feet wide or 4. It's about the size of my beds, and I just go down and aerate it. I put those tongs down in and lift it a couple inches just to aerate it, but it leaves all the layers the way they are, and the soil keeps the water so much better. So those are just a few things, tools. Once we began to implement the things we were learning, we started to grow great gardens. Tomatoes, raspberries, and beets, and peppers, and sweet onions. We do the Walla Walla onions in our area, carrots, cabbage, but you find out one year you have a great crop of onions, and it's not quite as good the next year maybe, but maybe the garlic is just phenomenal next year. And so you do want to realize that not every single year are you going to have a bumper crop of everything, but you want to have a good variety growing. And one of the amendments that we've learned to use that's made a tremendous difference in our garden and orchard is soft rock phosphate. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. You may have heard of rock phosphate. But soft rock phosphate is different. It is absorbed into the soil much more quickly. And phosphate is the factor that determines the mineral content in what you grow. So the mineral content is going to be the nutrition too. It's the quickest and best way to achieve a high level of mineral content in your soil. And it's not always easy to find, but well worth it. There was a deposit of it in southern Idaho. We used to take our old truck and go 12 hours, do a 12-hour drive down to southern Idaho and get just a whole truckload so that not only we but others in our area could have it. It makes such a difference. One year we had a cold spring, and I wasn't following all the advice that we would probably say was accurate, because my plants were just coming up, but they weren't doing much of anything, and I started getting worried, and I said, wow, I guess I better put some more rock phosphate on it, soft rock phosphate. And, that's really not the way. That's not the scientific way to garden at all. But I was that way that year, and I said, I'm just going to put some more on. Maybe I didn't put enough on. So I put some on, and then when the weather turned warm, my garden started taking off, and it grew, and I had a gigantically tall garden that year. The corn was like 11 feet tall, and the sunflowers were like 12 feet tall, but they all produced, so it was okay. But they were just gigantic. And at the end of the year, when I was putting my garden to bed, what we call it in the fall, and I went down to pull up the tomato plants and stuff, I couldn't get the sunflowers to budge when I was pulling on them. And so I went up to the house, and Craig is very strong, and I said, Craig, could you come help me with the sunflower plants? I cannot get them to budge. He came down, he couldn't get them to budge. He finally took our tractor, put a chain around each sunflower plant, and pulled it out with the tractor. And when we saw the root system, we went, oh, no wonder, because soft rock phosphate really helps the roots. And these just had tremendous root systems on them where they wouldn't even budge by hand. Did you know you can grow your own sustainable fertilizer? That's something else to think about, because many people think, well, I'm going to have to stockpile a bunch of fertilizer. But one of the gentlemen that we filmed, I believe it was Bob Gregory, said, take an area the same size as your garden and grow alfalfa in that area. And as that alfalfa comes up, you clip it throughout the summer, and you take those clippings and you put it over around your vegetables and around your fruit trees. And as it breaks down, it's going to release tremendous amounts of minerals and nutrients into the soil, because alfalfa sends its roots down 18 to 20 some feet into the soil. It gets all kinds of things way deep and brings that up. And so when you clip it and use it as a mulch around your plants, you're putting your own fertilizer on those plants. And he said you can use that area for about 7 years for the alfalfa, and then you'll want to switch. That's why you do them about the same size as your garden, because he said then put the garden where the alfalfa was, the alfalfa where the garden was, and you'll have a sustainable fertilizer. Here's a late summer crop, tomatoes. In our area, I use black plastic to keep down the weeds, but it also helps the soil to warm up quickly in the summertime, in the spring. And that may not be necessary here, but I know last weekend we were in Templeton, and they said, we get really cold here. We have to have cool hoop houses and things, and I'm going to talk about hoop houses in a minute. So I know you probably don't get that cold here, but some areas in California do. And especially in northern or mountainous areas, it's important that crops like these tomatoes mature before the first killing frost. This may not be for you, but here's a formula that one of the gentlemen gave us. If you have plants that are full size, they're mature, but they're not starting to blossom yet, and you're in an area where they need to blossom so that things get going, so that you'll have the produce ready by the time the frost comes, then this actual solution can change a plant from vegetative growth, which is growing the leaves, growing the stems, and it'll send it into seed and fruit production. And I've used it, and it does. Within a few weeks, a week or so after you douse your plants with this, you will have lots of blossoms on the plants. Don't do it on a plant that is not fully mature in size, though, because it'll stop the growth of it, because it's going to start it producing its fruits and vegetables. So how about fresh greens year-round? You want to have it now when you go to the grocery store. You expect to get fresh greens in January and February. Your home grocery store, you should be able to too. And several different ways. One is to grow fall crops. These are cold hardy crops, kale and collards and spinach and things like that. You can grow them outside, but you can also have hoop houses, the very cheapest way that I know of to have a greenhouse. And those are in the photo right behind this. Now, this particular garden is not our garden. This is Bob Gregory's at the Berea Gardens Agricultural Center. And he was the one that told us a lot about hoop houses. And one of these hoop houses, by the way, 48 feet long, 16 feet wide, 8 feet tall, if properly managed, Bob Gregory says you can feed 4 families for a whole year from one hoop house. So if you don't have a lot of property, that's something you want to learn about. I'm going to give you lots of information to get the wheels turning, and that way you can do more research on each of these things yourself. But in those hoop houses, you can have things growing year-round, 12 months out of the year. They don't require any heat other than from the sun, and Elliot Coleman's books talk about them, the Winter Harvest Handbook, 4-Season Harvest. We have DVDs showing some of these hoop houses because some of the people that we have filmed, like the Dysinger family in Tennessee, they use them in their work. That's their business. There's one more way to have fresh greens year-round, super quick, super easy, sprouting. You can have fresh greens in just a day or two. You can grow them right on your kitchen counter. You can sprout seeds, nuts, legumes, grains, and by the way, when they're sprouted, you may not realize that God put a powerhouse in those seeds, and when they're sending shoots up and roots down, which is what's happening when they're sprouting, they will have so much more nutrition in them than they would if you just ate the seeds. 300 to 1,200 times the nutrition at that time when they're sprouting. So it's a super easy, good way to get a lot of nutrition and quickly. I do a sunflower seed pate. You know, you think about sprouts, you think you're eating something green and crunchy, but not always. I sprout these sunflower seeds. Takes about 8 hours on the counter to sprout them. And I put them into I soak them overnight, and then I sprout them for about 8 hours, and I put them into a food processor with garlic and lemon juice and salt, and they become a creamy pate, kind of like a mock chicken salad. It is delicious. One of the, these aren't time of trouble things I'm talking about. These are good things that we eat all the time right now. It's wonderful. You want to get a small orchard going as soon as possible. We have a DVD called Planting by the Blueprint, where Lynn Hoag from Placerville shows step by step how to plant fruit trees in the same way that Ellen White was shown in a dream when she was in Australia. It is an incredible way to plant anything deep-rooted. You can plant grapevines that way, even tomatoes. We've done tomatoes that way too. But things produce quickly, they're very nutritious. It is a more labor-intensive way to start them out. You're not just digging a little hole and putting them in. You're doing some 3x3 hole. But one gentleman that I know, he did some testing on it, because he said one of the layers is some rock, and he said a lot of people think, well, that's for drainage. But he said, we did some testing, and in that hole, what was happening? There were magnetic things happening with the positives and the negatives that go on like in batteries. And he said, wouldn't you expect, though, if this instruction was given of how to plant, wouldn't you expect it to be something very special, very good? And people all over the world have had incredible results planting this way. We have ourselves, but we know others who have taken the DVD and even in other countries planted acres of trees using this method. So it's a great help. And we also have a fruit culture DVD where one of the other gentlemen shows how to prune your trees and things like that. I used to be mystified by the pruning part, because I would look at pictures and I couldn't quite figure it out. I needed to actually see somebody do it. And Bob Jorgensen is up in that tree showing you, okay, see the branch is going this way, you want it to grow this way, clip here. It's very, very helpful. Did you know, I'm sure you don't grow cherries here, do you? Not cold enough. Most everywhere I go, I ask, if they grow cherries, and if they do, I say, well, what happens on the day that the cherries are ripe? And everybody knows. I don't know, does anybody know here? Okay, what happens? Birds arrive. Everybody knows that. They have a feast. And one of the gentlemen we filmed said, put some hummingbird feeders in your cherry trees. The hummingbirds will not eat the cherries, but they are so territorial that they will not allow any other bird around. And it works. It's fantastic. It is more fun. Sometimes when I'm on our way down to the garden and I get to the garden gate and the cherry trees are at the back behind the vegetable garden, and I'll hear this activity going on, and then all of a sudden these big birds will fly off, and I'll know those little hummingbirds were doing their job. Last summer, my husband was in a terrible accident in June. His neck was broken. He lost 60% of the blood in his body. He is a walking miracle, and praise the Lord is right. And we were gone from our home. The day the accident happened was my birthday. We had gone out to lunch, and then he ran some errands, and I was with our children and grandchildren. And I didn't get to go home for 2 months, sometime in August we went home. And so there went my garden. And I had taken some pictures of the garden either that day or a day or two before. And on one of our son's websites, susprep.com, he has a blog. And he has a thing I wrote about what happened to our garden, because it was most interesting. Once again, going along with, if we do what we can, God will do what we cannot do. Because I was not able to be home. And normally I watered every couple days, and no watering going on, except for we had our kids, I think, watered 2 or 3 times during that time, and then some other friends came to do something at our house, and so they watered twice. Anyway, it was like 6 times or something during the time we were gone. And just before we left, our cherry trees were ripening to the point that I had put hummingbird feeders in the cherry trees, and they were full of the liquid. Well, that liquid is normally gone in less than a week, just a few days. Once the hummingbirds find the little container, then they're going to go through it very quickly. So there had been weeks and weeks that there was not any food for them in the hummingbird feeder. But when in August, the first day we got home, I didn't even go to the garden. There was too much else going on. And the next day I went down, and the cherry trees were full of dead, ripe, red cherries that were still on the trees. And I'm like, how is this possible? And I went and I said, I better do my part now. I better go get a container and start picking like crazy, because there's no birds here going after them, and they're still on the trees. And I went and I started picking, and I hadn't been there but a few minutes, and bzz, 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 there were those hummingbirds coming around, seeing me picking, and they were going to guard their territory from me. And I said, thank you, Lord. You kept those birds protecting those trees, even when they weren't getting food, because I couldn't come here, but they protected, and I didn't see that there were any cherries that had been attacked and gone. So we had a wonderful crop, and we had all kinds of other, our garden was good, and we had the best year of corn, the best year of Honeycrisp apples. All I can say is it wasn't us. It was our Heavenly Father who knew that we couldn't do it during that time. Have a 7-foot fence if you possibly can. For years we weren't able to afford a fence around our garden and orchard. And I got very discouraged because the deer and the moose would have rodeos in the evenings and nights at our garden. I could see because I came down and I saw all the hoof prints in the morning, and they ruined our trees, and it was a mess, and I'd get so discouraged. But once we put up a 7-foot fence, no more problem. Now our things were for us to eat, not for them. And if you're just starting and you're in an area that has fruit trees, then see if some of the places will let you glean. Did you know that? Of course, you can go to farmers markets. You have to pay for things there. But some places will let you glean for free after the pickers have gone through. We did that for a number of years to just build up our supply of fruits. And if you talk to the managers or the owners and they know what you're doing, sometimes they will. So that's something to think about. And if you live in fruit country, here's a little tool. This is a Victorio strainer. You can make homemade applesauce. You can go through boxes of apples in a morning because it so shortens the process of making the applesauce. All you have to do is cook those apples, especially if they're organic, so rinse them, quarter them, leave the stems, the seeds, the skin, everything. Just quarter them and cook them till they're soft enough to run through this strainer. It's called a Victorio strainer. And out will come the applesauce down that slide, and then you can't see it, but on the back side there's a hole, and out of that comes the seeds and the skin and the core material. It is super wonderful. They cost like $60 or $70 on Amazon, maybe $75. You can get extra kinds of strainers. I also use my strainer for raspberries because my husband doesn't like the seeds in the jam. You can run berries through the strainer, and it'll take out the seeds. Just super for speeding up the process. And speaking of berries, that's a very important part of your home produce department. Easy to grow. Generally, they produce prolifically. You generally can figure out what kind of berries are good for your area because all you have to do is plant the right kind and they go crazy. In our area, it's raspberries. I know over in the Portland, Oregon area and in areas like that, it's blackberries. They're growing by the side of the road. You know, it's just a very prolific way to get the small fruits. And as far as berries, you could even include wild edibles. On our property, we have huckleberries. And huckleberries are very, very popular in our area. And usually they're in the higher elevations, which we are in, and they sell for up to $50 a gallon. This is a cash crop if you want it to be, because we could pay our property taxes from selling huckleberries most years. So learn what grows in your area. These are things that God planted. He waters, He fertilizes, and all we have to do is go pick them. So check out the wild edibles. You can go online and find out how to use what's in your area. Seed saving, most important, because we may not always be able to buy seeds at any point in time for any number of reasons. Some seeds, like tomatoes, you have to take through a little fermentation process to make them viable for the next year, most of them, but most things just go to seed. I have a picture, I don't have it here, but of some of my little Tom Thumb lettuce plants, and when I let them go to seed, they grow about 3 feet tall, and they have thousands and thousands of seeds on them. We serve a God of abundance. He doesn't want us to go hungry. One little lettuce plant, thousands and thousands of seeds. Did you know you can produce your own oil from nuts and seeds? You can get a small expeller press, oil expeller press called the Piteba press, P-I-T-E-B-A. I have a cookbook in the back, and I have all of these different pieces of equipment and their websites mentioned in it, but I want you to be able to get information about this. I didn't know this for a long time, and I took a class in Oklahoma one time when we were going through it, when we were giving seminars actually, and someone else was teaching a class about this Piteba press. And it was more fun. We made all kinds of oil from different nuts and seeds. The sunflower seeds, it just poured out. And if you didn't mind it being a little bit cloudy, you didn't even have to take the shells off the sunflower seeds. My favorite one was pecan oil, made from pecans. It had the most delicate pecan taste. One time I saw some for sale in a gourmet shop, very, very expensive. Just think, we're told we can live like kings and queens. There's another dimension to that. We can have things that nobody else can have if we grow them, or that very few people can have. And as you decide to grow, think year-round. For instance, we planted a couple of Bing cherry trees, sweet cherries, but we also planted Montmorency cherries, which are the sour or pie cherries. These are the ones that those hummingbirds protected for me. They're quite tart. They're not really tasty for eating fresh, but dehydrated, they're fabulous. If you go to Costco and places like that, if they tell the variety, I have a bag with us right now that I think I got them at Costco, Montmorency dried cherries. They're just the best, and they're what we plant those for eating year-round. And that brings us to step number 4, store and preserve what you grow. You've got to do this if you're going to be able to eat year-round from your garden and orchard. Root cellars and cool rooms are for types of produce that you can store just as it is for weeks and months at a cool temperature. And they use the temperature of the earth to keep them. Now, I was talking to somebody yesterday because when we gave seminars in Houston, I realized that you can't do a root cellar in Houston. You dig and there's water right there. And you probably are in a similar situation here. Florida is similar. They use spring houses, isn't it, in Florida? So there's usually other things that people learned to use in the area that they're in, but using the temperature of the earth to keep things cool, to refrigerate things that you have grown. Here's a root cellar that we showed in one of our DVDs, Urban Danger. And there's an excellent book on roots called Root Cellaring. That's the name of the book, by Mike and Nancy Bubel, B-U-B-E-L, kind of known as the standard that you can read all different ways to use the temperature of the earth to keep your things fresh. You can build a root cellar into a hill near your home if you have a hill. Or you can use your basement. Or you can do trenches in your garden and clamps, what they call clamps, to store potatoes outside. But remember, the cool room and the root cellar just extend it for a limited period of time. This is our cool room. In our situation, a cool room works well because we have very cold nights all the time, and so using the windows in the room. When our son moved out of our cabin, we made his room into a cool room. We super insulated it, and it has been really nice and very easy access. Some of the root cellars are a little harder. You may have to climb down a ladder or something to get into them, but they're wonderful also. So then there are 2 basic methods that will preserve food for an extended time: dehydrating and canning. Dehydrating is the way to go for anything that you like in its dehydrated form or rehydrated form, because it preserves from 95 to 97% of the nutrition that was in that fruit or vegetable. That's incredible to me, that much of the nutrition can be preserved. It's one of the least expensive ways. You can use your oven. You can use an electric food dehydrator. Excalibur is a well-known model, but I've used some of the cheaper models, and they worked well too. Or you could build your own solar dehydrator. Here's a website that gives instructions of how to build this particular one. Quite a nice one, actually. And that's solarfooddryer.com. But here on our son's blog, susprep.com, they show something that our son made out of stuff he just had. He just had it around the place. 3 cement blocks, a few lengths of 2x4s, a piece of metal roofing, a fan, and an old piece of glass window pane. And they're dehydrating some Bing cherries there, and that's some granola pans on the back side of that. And if you've never had dehydrated granola, it is so good. It's so much better than the regular kind. And here's another way to dehydrate in the wintertime or the fall. And a lot of times people like to do apples this way, because the apples will store well for a period of time. And then when you get time, you're done with all your other canning and stuff, you can put a rod above a wood cook stove or above just a wood stove, and you can do apples and things like that on that rod. Canning, there's 2 methods of canning, water bath and pressure canning. They're both specific for different reasons. Canning particularly is something that many people are afraid of, and there's really no reason for this. Like many things, you just have to learn to do it safely. Probably the most important thing I could say to you today about canning is purchase a Ball Blue Book. I meant to bring some on this trip, but somehow we got off without them. But you can find them at hardware stores, Walmart, anywhere that there's a canning supply section. They generally have the Ball Blue Book because they put out a book every year. They've been going for decades, and the first 10 to 15 pages is like a short safety course to learn how to can safely, because cooking is an art, canning is a science. Many people can, then they get afraid to eat what they can. They're afraid maybe they did something wrong. You know, maybe it's not going to be safe. And you can get botulism. It's rare, but you can get botulism, and there's things that you do have to be aware of. And that's why I say purchase the Ball Blue Book. It's usually $9.95 or less, and it will give very detailed instructions about each of the methods for canning and why you do what you do. The water bath method is for things that are considered to be high acid foods. They do not have to be processed any higher than 212 degrees, which is boiling. So it's called the boiling water bath. And that would be fruits, tomatoes, or anything that's pickled, high acid. They have to have a pH of 4.6 or less. And most people with even a little bit of canning experience have generally done this method. Make your jams that way and things that are fairly simple and easy. You don't have to have a lot of supplies, just a tall stock pot with a lid and a little, like a little tray in the bottom, or you can even use a washcloth if you don't have something to keep it from jiggling on the bottom of the canner. But you need to have it tall enough so that your jars can be completely covered with water during that process. I'm not going to go into the whole method. Get the Ball Blue Book. And then other things, vegetables, and if you eat meats, the meats are low acid foods, and these have to be processed at higher than 212 degrees so that all the bacteria, including the botulism spores, can be killed off. And pressure canning is the only way that you can raise temperatures above 212, because you're using pressure then, steam pressure, and it can go up to 240, 250. You need a special piece of equipment to do this, a pressure canner. Now you can get a variety of pressure canners at hardware stores and Walmart and places like that, and they may run $80, $90, something like that. We invested a little bit more money in the All-American pressure canner. The reason is all of the others are dependent upon a rubber gasket to be able to build up that pressure. But the All-American is made where it has a metal-to-metal seal. There's no rubber gasket in there. It will fit tight enough that it will build up pressure right within that. And we thought that was important, because if you are depending upon that gasket, what if you lose it? What if it breaks? What if it becomes brittle? What if it stretches out? Anything can happen over years. And that way, we didn't have to worry about a gasket. It is more expensive. It's like around $200, and you have very different sizes of the pressure canner that you can get. Different than a pressure cooker in that it's much larger. You put the jars in this. You're not just putting foods in it like a pressure cooker. This is a pressure canner. So check out that. Not going to go into more detail, but just realize that it's going to be a little more expensive, but it's an important tool that you want to have. Some people, I'm just going to briefly cover the fears. Botulism, one of those things. Once again, if you have canned properly, if you've followed the rules, you might say, you should not have any trouble. If you've used the higher temperatures, and if you do it for the period of time that you're told to, and you let it cool down naturally. Some people used to put, in the northern climates, they'd set their pressure canner out in the snow or put it in the sink and put cold water on it. You're messing with the pressure then, and you're also messing with the time, because when the Ball Blue Book says use this amount of time to do it and then turn it off, they're still counting the time that it would take for that pressure canner to cool down. That's part of the time needed for safety. So that's all I'm going to say about botulism, but it should not be something you have to worry about if you follow the rules. Now, a lot of people say, oh dear, I'm afraid the pressure canner is going to blow up on me. Have you ever heard that? A lot of people are afraid of it. In the early years of our giving our seminars, I used to do the demos. Now we have DVDs as of the last couple of years with actual showing the demos step by step. But when I was doing them, I would often ask anybody if they'd ever known anybody that had had a pressure canner blow up on them. And I think in all the places, it was very rare, but there may have been 2 or 3 times. And I'm not positive. I mean, there's always freak things that can happen, but generally speaking, I believe when something like this happens, it happens because you haven't followed the rules, generally speaking. You need to check your equipment every year and make sure it's working properly, make sure that nothing's plugged up, but I've never had the first indication of a problem. But some people just want to see it done. I wanted to. In the 90s, when I said, oh, this is something I want to learn, and I had grown up in a family that was a wonderful Christian family, but I'd never learned a lot of these things, and so I wanted to learn, and I tried to find somebody that would teach me, and I couldn't find anybody. And so I had to teach myself with the Ball Blue Book, but I would have given just about anything to have seen it done. That's just the way I'm made up, just to see it done, to know, oh, am I doing it the right way or not? And so if you're that kind of a person, we have the demos on DVD where you can see it done. In fact, you can push pause, and while you're doing it, you can be watching it. So that is the other fear that I could think of with canning was, what if you didn't can enough food to make it through to the next harvest? Because I don't know, we come from a generation that hasn't figured out how much it would need to take our family from one harvest to the next. As Craig mentioned yesterday, Congressman Bartlett said when he grew up in that poor family with a number of children, he said, we knew we had to can 1,000 quarts a year or we would starve. I had a friend, her mom passed away in a year that she had already canned, I think it was 1,200 quarts because she knew. And when I would do the demos, we would kind of go through a mental process with people. Do a little experiment. Do some meals at home where you're just using your canned products and see how many jars it takes to a meal, and then do some multiplication. If you're in a northern area, you're talking huge numbers of jars, 1,500, 1,600. Down here it would be different. But what I'm saying is, that's kind of unrealistic to be able to, from your own garden and orchard, produce that much for canning. So my advice is, don't rely just on canning. Do a lot of dehydrating if you can. Use a root cellar, diversify. And one of the best ways to really stretch what you're canning would be to have your own home bakery. Now, how you think, how does that fit in with the canning? Well, just think about this, and that's our grain mill. That's the only way to have sustainable flour. You can store the other more refined flours, but if you want to be able to continue having things, have a supply of wheat, you can store it. Wheat stores for centuries if stored properly, or you can grow it if you want to. We choose to store ours, but you need to have a grain mill to have a home bakery. But I want to give you some examples of how having baked goods can really expand and amplify and extend your supply of canned, dehydrated, or root cellared foods. Think about this. Would you rather eat a jar of canned peaches or cherries all by themselves, sit down with that jar, put a spoon in, you know, that you'd survive on that. But how about serving these delicious fruits on top of some tender, flaky, homemade biscuits? What about your homegrown beans, different kinds of beans, garbanzos and other kinds? You could just open up a jar and you could heat them and you'd have a meal, you'd have something to eat. But wouldn't it be nice to be able to blend those beans along with some garlic, lemon juice and salt, make it into a delicious hummus? Then you could make a nice sandwich with homemade pita pockets or some other kind of bread and put some other things in with it. Would you prefer to eat a bowl of plain canned apricots? Or how about taking a slice of toasted homemade whole wheat bread, spread with homemade almond or hazelnut or peanut or whatever kind of nuts you have in your area, that kind of butter? You can make that with a Champion juice, or you can make all kind of nut butters. And then you could top it with hot apricot preserves or pear sauce or applesauce or any other number of things. In your home bakery, you could make a pie crust and fill it with your home canned fruits for a great dessert. That's a huckleberry pie there. Actually, that's the cover of my cookbook, because I want to just tell you, I picked those huckleberries in, it would have either been late July or August, and I made that pie in March. Kind of get an idea. You can do things all year long with what you've grown, and it doesn't have to be just a jar and a spoon. You can make a pizza crust and top it with home canned pizza sauce. Add toppings. You can make a wonderful cheesy sauce just from garden vegetables that is fantastic on the pizza. That's a root burger in the lower picture, made basically from root vegetables, served with whole wheat bread, home canned pickles, home canned salsa, and that's actually mayonnaise made from almonds in that little glass container there. You can make your own tortillas and crackers and granola. You can even get a little non-electric Atlas pasta machine like the one I have there. 60s or maybe it's $75 or so now on Amazon. You can make your own pasta. Takes about 20 minutes. It is more fun. It's the best pasta you ever had. If you have kids, they're going to love doing it. You don't even have to have a pasta machine. You can just have a rolling pin and a knife, and you can make your own pasta. But then you can top it with homegrown, home-canned pasta sauce. Much better. You getting the picture? You can eat good this way. It's fun, and you can eat good. And I hope this gives you an idea of how your own home bakery items can really extend the stuff that you have preserved or kept in your root cellar. Learning how to become more independent for your food is a huge topic. No one ever wants to go hungry. No one in our country, very few people do. I'm not saying no one, but very few people do. How many times, though, in history has food been used to manipulate people? It hasn't been a week or two since I heard on the news that they were using food in Venezuela, and they actually worded it that way. And I said, that's what I say in my seminars. They were saying he's manipulating people with food, their lack of food, and what they have to do to get that food. So the bottom line is, if you truly want to be able to make real meals from your garden and orchard, you need to start today. Even if you're in an apartment building, get some pots, get some, we know, did you tell the story yesterday about in DC, the fellow, can't remember his name? He was a school teacher, came to our seminars in the DC area, got very inspired. They lived on the 6th floor of an apartment building, and he thought, what can I do? You know, here we are. But they said, well, they went to Costco or somewhere and they got some honeydew melons, and they saved the seeds. And then they got some little styrofoam cups, and they had a little balcony off their apartment. They kept their bikes out there. He and his wife were both school teachers. In the summertime, they didn't teach. And so they started these seeds in these little cups. And the little plants sprouted and all. And before long, the plants were sending their tendrils around their bicycle wheels and all over on their balcony, and they were getting so excited. And then somebody said to them, well, you're not going to get any fruit, because they started having blossoms. They said, you're not going to get any fruit if you don't have bees to pollinate them. And I think they started praying for bees or something. And they said one day that about noon, they noticed, and here comes a bee from up above. And it was coming down, and it went right to their little plants, and it started going from flower to flower to flower. And they were so excited. And they said the next day the same thing happened. And it happened day after day, to the point that they named the bee Willie Bee. They said, "Willie Bee coming?" And they got wonderful melons from that. Now, that wasn't enough for them to live on for a year, but it got them started. And the next summer, I think it was her dad, had a plot of land somewhere that they could grow on, even though they were still in the apartment. But now they could grow, and they got to have a little bigger garden. And we met them again, and they told us that story at another seminar, and we haven't seen them since then. But you know what? God can open the way. Doesn't matter what your situation is. Now's the time to begin experimenting to see what works best, not only for your garden, but also for your family, and start learning all you can right now. Thank you.
How many of you are hungry after seeing all that? Isn't it amazing what you can do right in your home just with a few simple tools? Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We're going to have more presentations, and what I want to do before we move forward is enable to have this ministry continue to move forward. We want to help give them a love offering, and if you can help us with that, that would be such a blessing. Traveling down here to us wasn't free, and so we want to help support them in that. Would you all bow your heads as we get ready to have a love offering? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the blessings of life, health, and strength. And Father, we want to do better. We want to be able to be free and to have a sustainable preparedness like this ministry is reminding us. And we pray that as they've been sharing so many good tips and knowledge with us, that you would help us to also be able to help them back. We thank you for this. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Before we break for lunch, I just want to bring your attention to the wealth of information we have out in the form of DVDs and books. What we've covered yesterday and especially today is just scratching the surface compared to the information on the DVDs that have been produced by our ministry, particularly Nick. We have traveled over the years to meet experts in their particular fields, to film them, so they can share their decades and decades of information with you on sets of DVDs. And so I just want to, before we break for lunch, I want to show you a short clip that'll give you just a little taste of what these DVDs are like, our resource materials, DVDs, books, etc. So before we break, I'll come back up and we'll have the blessing. Well, I guess you can have your own blessing. We're not going to be eating potluck, I guess, today. So I'll come back up and dismiss us after this is over.
You've likely heard of our practical homesteading DVDs that have helped literally thousands of folks across the world learn the practical nuts and bolts to become as independent as possible from the systems of the world. I'm particularly concerned about how dependent almost everyone is on the system for their most basic necessities of life, such as water and heat and food.
For years, we've been steadily producing more and more training DVDs by numerous experts in an effort to shorten your learning curve and save you the time and money that would be lost from needless mistakes. We're talking about skills like gardening, dealing with fruit trees, developing a springhead, food preservation, wood cook stoves, natural remedies, and a whole lot more. Really, we just want to see you succeed. And time and again, we have seen what an incredible impact it makes to have access to the right training ahead of time.
I don't know about you, but I'm tired of chasing down rabbit trails, and wasting my time and money by trying out some harebrained theory dreamed up by an expert and posted on YouTube. I don't have time for that. I want solid info presented by an instructor with lots of real-world experience. I want the methods that just plain work, and that's what you get in our DVDs. The Gardening Collection is our 6 DVD set with fall gardening, spring gardening, and the year-round gardening DVDs.
So in the Fall Gardening double DVD set, you'll learn the key building blocks for starting out your garden successfully. You'll learn why fall is the best time to start preparing your garden and how to do it right step by step, from breaking up virgin ground to planting a fall crop. You'll see how to take a soil sample and add the right amendments for balancing your soil so your food not only looks pretty, but more importantly, is super packed with nutrition.
Spring gardening picks up where fall gardening left off. The 3 DVDs in this set teach you how to wake up your garden in the spring, how to direct plant and transplant in the garden beds, caring for the young tender plants, scaling up to larger field crops, step-by-step instructions on building a low-cost compost bin that really works, and much more.
So year-round gardening takes you on a tour of a working small-scale farm that grows produce all year long. You'll learn their tips for success, especially for growing in the cold seasons.
When it comes to having a secure food source, diversity is so important. If you lose certain crops from an infestation of pests or disease or weather-related problems, being diversified can save the day, as problems that impact one crop may leave another one untouched. So large and small fruits are an essential addition to any vegetable garden. Our double DVD fruit culture collection shows you how to handle small fruits like blueberries, strawberries, and grapes, in addition to larger fruits like apples. You'll learn how to save yourself a ton of money by grafting your own new fruit trees, how to prune fruit trees and propagate grapes, and more.
And speaking of fruit trees, Planting by the Blueprint demonstrates a very unusual method of planting fruit trees that many have found to yield exceptional results. Fruit trees take years to bear much fruit, and this unique method gives your new fruit trees the start they need to grow quickly and grow strong. This really is required watching before you plant your fruit trees.
Finally, making a tasty meal straight from the garden is often an unfamiliar task that many find difficult. With this in mind, you'll be getting the Contemporary Artisans Collection book. In this practical cookbook, you'll get many recipes and ideas on how to make delicious meals when eating from your garden. But it's more than just a cookbook. It also has a host of helpful tips for storing, preserving, and for using food on the homestead.
So growing food is great, but it's only the first step. You'll also have to preserve that food for use during the winter. That's why we produced the 4 DVD set, Preserving the Harvest. This thorough yet concise set visually demonstrates the various ways to preserve your food for use during the winter. You'll learn all about canning with an actual demonstration of both water bath and pressure canning. It's not scary, and in fact, it can actually be fun if you know what you're doing. You'll learn how to properly dehydrate, freeze, vacuum seal, cure, and culture food properly and safely. We even show you how to preserve grains indefinitely and use root cellars. There's even a segment that demonstrates how to make your own delicious homemade bread.
In addition to all that, you'll learn how to plan your food needs out and actually come up with a fairly accurate estimate of what food and how much food your family uses and needs. The methods we teach in these videos will make sure the food you store never gets too old and that you don't end up with a bunch of disgusting food stashed in your basement waiting until it goes bad. This is for a working pantry and a homestead that is perpetually prepared, not a doomsday bunker.
That's right. So the Homestead Skills Collection starts out with the only totally independent and reliable source of heat, and that's wood heat. The most versatile way to heat with wood is using a modern Amish-made wood cook stove. With one fire, you can not only heat your home, but also heat your hot water and cook and bake your food, all with that one fire. Our DVD, Getting Started with Wood Cook Stoves, shows you how to properly use and get the most out of your stove. It covers everything from choosing the right wood to the nuts and bolts of how to actually cook with a wood cook stove.
When living in a rural area, it's especially important to prevent a home fire, since it can take a while for the fire department to arrive. In our DVD, Dealing with Fire on the Homestead, a rural fire chief walks you through the important precautions that you need to know about. In addition, anyone who heats with wood should be aware of several common sense rules that make a chimney fire all but obsolete. But what if the unthinkable happens and you do have a fire? What do? You'll learn straight from the fire chief's mouth what your best course of action is. Even wildland fires are considered in this important presentation.
All the other things we've mentioned are of little use if you are incapacitated from sickness. And while there is a lot of attention given to the benefits of herbal remedies, there's another important modality that is largely untapped and is incredibly helpful. I'm talking about hydrotherapy, the use of water externally on the body, often using a contrast of hot and cold. And what could be a simpler remedy than water? We have found it to be incredibly effective in our home when dealing with many health-related issues in our family. You'll learn all about it in our DVD ebook combo, The Lost Art of Natural Remedies, Hydrotherapy.
Tools for Country Living walks you through an experienced homesteader's tool room and demonstrates what to look for and what sort of useful tools you might find at a yard sale for little to nothing. Most of these tools are low-tech, non-electric hand tools that are incredibly useful on any homestead.
Then, of course, there's water, perhaps the king of all the necessities. While most folks realize that being on a municipal water system is not a good idea, they don't think about the fact that most folks living in the country have a well, and that well does them no good when the power is down. Think electric pump.
But while there are ways to set up a well independently, there's an often forgotten water source that used to be extremely common years ago, springs. But how do you develop a spring, protect it from contamination, and channel it into a pipe? Our DVD Springhead Development demonstrates in real life how to do it using a time-tested method developed by a man with many springheads under his belt.
While it's an important necessity to learn the nuts and bolts of homesteading, sometimes it really helps to just take a tour of homesteads where folks are actually implementing various aspects of this lifestyle. That's exactly what you'll find in our epic DVD, Urban Danger. Not only will you tour a wide variety of homesteads and see how they do things, you'll find it to be quite inspirational to see the impact this lifestyle has on their lives. This is also a great DVD for sharing with folks you care about and would like to consider making a transition in this direction.
One of our most popular products is a DVD set that I consider to be required for anyone who's serious about food independence. It all started several years ago when we decided to put our money where our mouth was and take a 5-day intensive hands-on gardening course by Bob Gregory, a man that I consider to be one of the foremost experts on all things gardening. It cost $500 a person at that time, now it's over $600, and I can tell you that it was worth every penny. I highly recommend it. But not everyone can take a week off of work and travel to West Virginia and pay $600 for a course. So I talked with Bob and we filmed his course and put it on DVD for the benefit of those who couldn't attend in person. And it's called Food Growers Guidelines and turned into 9+ hours on 6 DVDs that are absolutely packed with what you need to take your garden to the next level. Not only do you learn about soil science, but you'll learn the best approaches for dealing with pests, such as how to use the disease triangle to your advantage and avoid costly and damaging sprays whenever possible. I can't recommend this training enough.
Finally, we come to Solar Power Basics, our newest DVD set. This set starts with an extremely popular online mini course that we put together and greatly expands it. You'll take a tour through our off-grid home, learn what components go into an off-grid solar system, how they all fit together, and how you can start this whole process right now.
You'll learn all about off-grid batteries, how to choose the right ones and maintain them properly, and I share with you how to dramatically cut the cost of your power system by becoming energy efficient. You'll learn about solar panels and charge controllers, and even how to do your own solar shade analysis to determine how much shade you can expect any month of the year. And you'll also learn what things you can start doing right now to begin your off-grid transition. And if you're a woman and wondering whether you could live off the grid, there's a section just for you.
DVDs, I don't think you can find anywhere in the world. They are highly instructional, very, very helpful. Now, before we break for lunch, I want to ask, by show of hands, we need to know how long we're going to break before we start this afternoon. In fact, let me just briefly tell you what we're going to be covering this afternoon. Remember the 3 basic necessities. You need to go home and look around your house and examine it and ask yourself, am I in a position here where I can develop systems to provide me my independent water system, independent heat, independent food? Well, Nancy just took you through creating, with the Lord's help, independent food. After lunch, I'm going to start with independent water systems. We're going to get into a lot of information on that. Those of you who live out in the country, how many of you live on a well? Very many here? 1. Okay, when the power goes down, we're going to talk about how to get that water out of the well and how to get it pressurized into your house where you can take a shower, where you can turn the washing machine on, et cetera, without the power grid. Now, unfortunately, I'll mention to the rest of you, if you're on the city municipal water system or a community water system, I don't know what to tell you. Well, I do know what to tell you. It's what the Lord tells you to do. So after that, we're going to just touch a little bit on heat. Most of you know how to throw a log in a stove, don't you? But we're going to talk about how to be safe, how to heat safely with the wood stove. And then on alternative energy, we're really not going to go into that. We don't have time, but we have the DVDs in the back that cover a wealth of information. And then Nick will tell you about the website he operates, and there's just a wealth of information that we can't cover on alternative energy. So we'll be covering that this afternoon when we get back from lunch. Now, let me ask you, how many of you need 30 minutes? Raise your hand. 30 minutes for lunch. Okay. How many of you need 45 minutes? How many need an hour? 30 minutes wins. Okay. The pastor has a short announcement. And just to be fair, it's 20 after 12. Let's meet back here at 1 o'clock. Okay? We'll see you at 1 o'clock.
All right. We invited you to bring a sack lunch, but we also have food. So please come and join us over in our fellowship hall. We've got some soups and other food there as well. And before we go over and break, can we just say a prayer and ask God to bless our food today? Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you that you are our creator and our sustainer. We ask that you would bless the food that has been prepared and those that brought it. And we pray that as we share together, that you will be in our midst. We thank you for this. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.